Gender equity attempts to facilitate equal opportunities for all genders to overcome their historical and social disadvantages by ensuring fairness and justice in the distribution of resources to all genders. And what it implies is that not everybody starts at the same place. And women, historically, socially, have not started in the same place as men. And now we're at a place where, we're moving to a more gender neutral way of thinking. And so how does that play a role in the world of gender equity and the ways that we've defined it? So my first question to you all is, what does gender equity mean to you? And so Karen, I'll start with you at the back over there.
Gender equity for me means the ability to gain access. And that's the access of information, the access of opportunity, the access of being in the room, at the table, to lend an ear of what is going on so that you're able to make an informed decision and, more importantly, make the best decision for yourself. So it's really, really about the ability to gain access to information and opportunity and capital and financing so that you can actually truly have a seat at that table. That's what it means to me.
Amazing. Kamshuka, how about you? How would you define gender equity? What does that mean for you? What does that feel like for you?
Coming from a wellness place, to me, it means the end result looks like better decisions. It means that the pathway to equality is equity. Equity, which is the fairness of giving everybody the distribution of information on the level that it's required. So we can make better choices. Better decisions can be made. Access to information when it comes to healthcare. So one party is not receiving the information they need for wellness, and then you have another group that is struggling. And I see that in my travels as well, especially as a woman when I am, for instance, when I'm in Uganda and I'm going through something health-wise, and I'm looking at all the options and I don't have the options available to me. It makes me think about, okay, how can I make this better? How can I be a part of educating? Is it the parents? Is it the different communities? Who do I need to bring this information to? How can I be a part of distributing the resources?
I love that. And it really dawned on me the other day when I was thinking about my overall wellness and what wellness looks like for us. So much information is behind paywalls, for example, on, new science and how to care for ourselves, what the best route to wellness looks like, for example, resourcing is a big issue, and it does make us see that, there is a certain level of privilege of just knowing information on wellness. So I thank you so much for sharing that. Cassandra, how about you? What does gender equity mean to you?
I would live and work in the world of business and economics and procurement. So when I think of gender equity, it's really about the equitable allocation and treatment for women at the business table. So whether that be access to capital, whether it be access to information, access to opportunity, depending on where you start from, as you said, it looks different. So if you come and you don't have the access to capital, it might not be simply saying, let me introduce you to a banker. It could be giving you the education about whether the opportunity is available. It could be someone investing in before you even have your own money. There's different ways to do it. So I see that you have to sort of meet women where they are. And in Canada, we're talking not just women now, we're breaking it down to women of color. Where do you come from? Because there's different circumstances you bring to the table. So when we talk about gender equity, for me, it looks vastly different, and it has to be more related to the person and where they come from. And so therefore, whether it be, as I said, information, whether it be opportunities, whether it be capital, or even resources, all that has to come to the table, and how we draft that so that the woman coming to the table is actually able to deliver at or go forward from that point.
Wonderful. And Margaret said it earlier in her keynote, where she needed her husband, for example, to get funding. And what a world to be in, to have to rely on somebody else to access resources to fulfill your dreams and to live your full potential. And so thankfully we've come a long way from that. It shows up in other nuances ways, which I'm sure we'll discuss today. But Charlene, how about you? What does gender equity mean to you?
I'm going to say the treatment of women. We're seen as emotional beings, and Margaret pointed out, she needed her husband, she needed somebody to rely on, because people don't think we're, capable enough, which is unfortunate. So for me, it is really the treatment of, a combination of everything that's said, but for me, it is the treatment, especially in my industry. So I also have an events background. So when I'm attending an event or a conference, it's so clear how women are treated compared to men, especially in the events industry. The events industry is supposed to be a female role per se, but the men get treated differently because that's just the way it is. And we have to deal with that. Same thing with the culinary background. Women are not seen as strong or as creative as our male counterparts. So for me, it really is the treatment of how we're treated.
I love that. And what we're really saying as we've described gender equity to be, it's really at a micro level and it's at a macro level. Micro level being, who are we as women in our households, as individual people, and supporting our families, but also macro. How are we, contributing to commerce, for example? How are we building our own businesses? And how do we, express ourselves in our fullest potential in all these areas of our lives? We hadn't started at the same place as men, and that's the reality of the situation. I recently read an article that, for example, we're talking about gender equity, and women are asked something like 10 times more in office to bring tea to their colleagues. It's like, okay, well, I guess that's what our role is in the office, is bringing tea. We're 10 times more likely to be asked to bring tea. And so some of these stats, when maybe, it's, someone's just asking us for tea. But, it really speaks to a deeper level and deeper issues that we have in our social constructs, and how we can find meaningful ways to kind of break through those barriers. So one of the ways is through education, and so that's really the topic that we're integrating today with gender equity and the role of education in moving the dial, as we keep saying, on gender equity. So my second question is really about education, and how would you define education and as it relates to gender equity? Charlene, I'll start with you.
So I'm going to say, my dad, I'm going to go back to my dad. He had everybody thought he was stupid. He had an 8th grade education, but he learned differently. So it's really important for me for educators to realize that not everybody learns the same, or is, I'm the same thing. Like, I'm a hands-on person. My dad is super hands-on. He's super smart. He's a tradesperson. So that is how he learned. He would look at something and say, okay, I can do this and this, and it would just come to him and he would be able to do it. So I think it's important for educators to realize that not everybody learns the same, because kids can be left back. Meanwhile, they're having other issues, and it's showing out in other ways, like they're getting angry or they're misbehaving. So I think it's important that we're looking at these situations carefully, because it's not the same across the board.
I love that, and it's interesting to think about how we receive information and different ways people learn. We think about, for example, certain disabilities, for example, and how we cater to those types of situations. One of the things that resonated with me that you mentioned around your father is also my mom. My mom, for example, she dropped out of school when she was she didn't drop out, but she had to leave school when she was 9 years old. And that was to care for the family. And I think about what education looked like for her, and it's through her lived experience and that informal experience that, you know, certainly goes under the radar and definitely isn't valued enough. I think about things like that when we think about how, you know, we all learn differently and have different opportunities for education. Kamshuka, how about you? How would you define education as it relates to gender equity?
Knowledge is power. And education is the vehicle closer to wisdom. So when I think of equity, I think of how there is no access. That is how it is in many areas, in many parts of this world, even in Canada, in different areas. Just like you said, everybody learns differently. But I also think of how if you know this one part about education, where you know that it's going to help you elevate, it's going to take you to the next level, but you don't have access to it, and everywhere you turn and you look, you're not able to get it. It's taking you longer to get the information you need. I think of the moment when I chose to train my brain. I think of the education that I couldn't find, and when it comes to wellness and how I was responding to my PTSD, how I was responding to the childhood wounds, I was responding to a lot of different ways that I was raised and all the different things that came with having immature parents who didn't know how to raise someone like me or give me the tools, even just therapy, or even just educating me to understand my emotions. I think of the moment when I got frustrated with myself, and I couldn't understand what was wrong with me because I didn't know how to process my emotions. And I remember thinking, I need to understand my brain. I can't understand what's going on with me, and I want to give up because it's confusion, it's chaos. There's no, for me as a survivor of war, the greatest wars I've ever faced were the ones in my mind. But it was also the ones that limited me, where I couldn't find, you know, sometimes it's not easy to have a mentor all the time. It's not easy to look for that if we're not made aware of the possibility. And so I started to study the brain. I took a course on the brain so I can understand where my memories were, so I can understand what was locked within my walls. And as I did that, I started to understand not just myself, but I started to understand my inner child. And that brought me to understand my 9-year-old child, who's my last born, and learns very differently. She processes information very differently. And she doesn't learn like the rest did. I don't even remember how the other kids got the information they got, but they just knew what to do. And for her, she needs extra time. And so understanding, unlocking the keys to my wealth of knowledge, which was educating myself, actually helped me unlock the keys to her mind and helped me know what to do with, how to help her process, how to bring herself to a calm space, how to still be in chaos, in you and around you, but still know how to be calm. So when I think of education, it really is the key to everything that we desire outside of us, when you learn from it.
I love that, because when we think about education, we think about it being this very scholarly process, very this institutionalized way of being and learning, and accreditations are really great. But what you're really saying, Kamshuka, is you're learning around how to create psychological safety for yourself and for your children. And imagine that how you empowered them to learn more about themselves.
And if I can add to that, when I started as an entrepreneur, I was a photographer, and I kept working at it, and in 2014, I won Best Black Canadian Woman Photographer. And I thought that was 2014, and I knew there was more to my purpose. There was more for me to unlock, and it would have to be in educating myself. So 2015, I became certified as a life coach, and then I went on to understand the brain, to learn the brain, and then to study mindfulness. So every step of the way, when you're acquiring a new skill and you're adding value to yourself, sometimes it's not available to you. You know, sometimes it's so much harder to access. And as hard as it was to crack these codes in my mind, I'm so grateful that I took that step as hard as it was.
I love that. And you know, we don't speak enough about how, for example, emotional intelligence and learning, you know, more terminology and having the language to describe emotions, especially, for example, even in the leadership space, right? You were learning more about mindfulness even at the workplace and how leadership and mindfulness connect together to create spaces where coworkers and our colleagues and our teams can thrive. And so these are all forms of education, and when we think about education, we don't always think about it in this form. And so luckily, we're at a place now where we're thinking a little bit more broadly about education, how education can be accessed with different learning types. And so with that, Karen, how about you? Tell us a little bit more about what education means for you, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback off of what Kamshuka said and the rest of the panelists. For me, education, it's a pursuit. It's really about pursuing who you are. I know it sounds like, but it's constantly understanding you. Like Kamshuka said, I process things very, very different. And I've come to learn that that's not a negative thing. That's just the way I process things. And so for me to go forward, I've got to pursue me. I've got to pursue how I do things, when I do things, why I do things. Ask myself these questions. And it's not that I'm any different. I just have I don't call it a disability, I have a different ability. And to me, that different ability is who I am. We're not the same. I'll never be you. You'll never be me. But that's really what makes us together strong. And so for me to come to the table, I gotta know me. I gotta spend that time on who I am and why I do the things that I do. Because really and truly, that's really who I am. So I can understand what the panelists have said, because I piggyback off of that. It's really understanding you and how you do things and how you process.
And you know, we say this, we're saying to ourselves, you know, we need to know ourselves. And for many years, as women, people have told us who we should be, right? And relearning how to understand ourselves and, you know, tapping into the information around, you know, personal development has really become quite popular. And, you know, for me personally, like I've had a lot of experience, you know, in the personal development pathway, as we can say. And, you know, one of the things is it does start within. And so I'm happy to hear that on the panel here, you feel like education, knowing ourselves is a form of education.
I just want to add something else too. I think it's important because some of our elders do not understand, especially in the Caribbean community, they don't understand that all of us learn differently, and it's looked upon as like a negative thing. And you know, why you're not learning your school books properly. Everything to them is, you know, follow the books, follow the rules in the books. So I think it's also important that our elders understand when it's important for us to seek help. And it's not something to be shamed about.
I love that intergenerational lens you just brought into space. Thank you. Cassandra, how about you? What does gender equity mean to you and education, for example? Like, how does education for you, how would you describe that in terms of gender equity?
Well, I think it's important that what we've heard from the other panelists, because there's so many very different segments as we talk about. Whether it's the personal segment, whether it's the emotional intelligence goes with that.
Peter's learning himself right now.
Jenny's got us.
It's applauding all the amazing gems here that we're hearing today.
My parents were exceptionally big on education being a factor that helps to elevate you. And so knowing that their children came at different spots, to them, the whole onus was education, get yourself through school. What do I need to do to get you through school? So we all took distinctly different paths. But in particular, my mom and dad were very big on, as females in the household, you don't know where you're going to end up. You need to make sure you're educated so that anytime you're able to elevate yourself and for your children, which you can be married. And so my mom and dad were very big on the girls making sure that they were educated along the path. The other point is, my sister, my older sister, when she did her doctorate, this was an lived experience of working out there, and that was part of what her doctorate was all about, making sure that lived experience added to the element of the educational institution experience. Because for women of color, we didn't have that institutional, and so therefore, be able to elevate to the point that we had the education, but we came through the learning experiences. That was a big thing that came to the table at that time. The other thing I'd like to say is that there's not enough women in positions that help us to be role models and see where we're at. So it's important as we get to this stage in our life, or as we move along, that we reach out to younger women and allow them the opportunity. Because I know when I was going through, things I know now, I wish people had told me, but it was this grateful elderly in my community who invited me in, and I didn't even know what they were doing at the time. And so that set up the stage for me that as I move through my life to do the same thing for younger women. Because as younger, you don't always know what's important or but when people introduce you to it, it starts to permeate over time, and so it sets the example. That's what I did. I can still remember my grade 4 teacher, and all the things she did for me that she didn't tell me, but later on it sort of set in. It's like, oh my God, that's what she was doing. So I think that part, we have to take that in and understand our role, at least my role, as I go forward, is to give that. And so it's set the stage so that I help to lay a path. They choose their own path. You're right. You know yourself. You know what's important. Make sure they're exposed to enough so they can choose what's important to them.
And I love that cyclical nature of education and how we can transfer knowledge to the younger generation and support them. Because mentorship in itself is a form of education, and it's probably one of the most important forms of education. And to see ourselves in other people, of course, we can know ourselves, but to see ourselves reflected back at us, that is very empowering, incredibly empowering. So I thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about what education looks and feels and sounds like to you all through lived experience, through formal education, through knowing ourselves, and learning from our families and the people before us, and now taking all of that and giving back into the community, as we should. So tell us a little bit more about. Here's where I'll ask a little bit more personal questions around your lived experience. Tell us a little bit more about any experiences that you've had with inaccess to education through whatever area of your life, any stage of your life, that you felt you probably did not benefit from the access of education. Cassandra, I'll ask you to share any experiences that you've had with inaccess to education.
Growing up rural, small town Nova Scotia, parents blue-collar workers, and so therefore there wasn't much money for us to actually do their higher education. So of course it's going to be a student loans to get yourself through, and luckily scholarships when they're available. And so for us it was really about, you might identify universities, but you're going to be able to pay to get yourself there. And one, you had to make it through our regular school system, which had its own obstacles. One, if you're a person of color, and two, if you're a woman. So you had to sort of come through that to get yourself to the top. So for the important thing is, like I remember earlier on, Professor Harrison College in the West, and I was going to go over there and apply to go there. But as a young woman of color, I didn't have the confidence to want to leave home at that time. I was like, grade 11, so I was like, should I do it? But in safety of the family, that meant more to me. And I realized that, we have to build confidence in the younger people, that if I had taken a step, my life would be a lot different, and I never live with regrets. But I want to make sure that the people, my nieces and nephews, have the opportunity to make those choices, they're confident enough to do that. And so, that was one thing that sort of, cemented in my mind that why didn't I take it because of lack of confidence? But then as I went through my university training, I gained when I went to do my executive MBA. I was a regular MBA because, I didn't know any better. And all of a sudden you're talking to your business cohorts and I said, well, why don't we do the executive? That's where you build your network and everything else. And I think we're not exposed to these discussions that help us make those choices. And it's really important to have that type of discussion with young people who look like us, so that they understand the world is wide open. Finances should not be the issue. A closed door should not be the issue, because you always know someone who knows someone who knows someone that can help improve. So when I did my executive, I didn't have the money, but there were community leaders who said, Cassandra, guess what? Go have fund your education. And that's the type of community spirit I think we should, embody and give back. So it enables me, so when I did mine, it's like the next thing is, I'm going to try to get it for the next person that's going to be mine. Not that I have this if should you wish to do that, how do I make it available?
I love that. I love that. And we don't think about the barriers that we have to education as women of color. When it comes to monetary funds, for example, those are really serious issues, especially for myself, who our family is an immigrant family. Having those networks or knowing that you need those networks isn't something that you know that you can actually tap into. So those are really big challenges for us as women of color. Karen, how about you? Have you had any lived experiences where you have inaccess to education, just it just wasn't available to you?
You know what, as I pondered that question, luckily for me, as I said, I've had hiccups along the way, and thank goodness I had very strong mom, parents who were, I'm going to speak the patois, but it doesn't sound the same. Make sure you go to university and get your education. Make sure you go, I know it doesn't sound the right way, but anyhow. And my mom made it very, very clear, that's where you're going to go. So whatever you can run around and do what you want to do, but at the end of the day, education gives you a broader scope. And thank goodness, I'll never forget a teacher who looked like me, who took an interest in me, and who was there. And I'll never forget Pat Morrison, and she was there to be an amazing support. She opened up a lens for me that my parents talked about, right? There was the practice. There was a theory, but that was the practice. And so, even though I had challenges, even though I had a different learning style, she was there to embrace it and say, no, that's okay. We're gonna work through that. So again, it's having people along the way that understand you, that support you. I can speak of Kinsley also being able to understand who I am, what they see things within you, and that you may not see for yourself. But the mere fact that, again, I had access to that, it opened up a lens for me. And so that I could then decide, hey, you know what, this is what I want to do. But if I didn't have that access, and I didn't have that mentor, because we didn't call them at that time, we didn't call them mentors, but it gave me access. It gave me an opportunity to see what would be best for me. And at the end of the day, it is education. And then what you choose to do from there, as I said, it just gives you that entry. That's all that is. It's an entry. And then from there, you go from there. But that's yeah.
And it's really one of the, I guess what we're really driving home is the importance of education and how that can open up so many paths for us. Kamshuka, how about you? In your lived experience, have you ever felt like you didn't have access to education, or has that affected your journey in any way?
I haven't ever felt that way personally. I think for myself, it's more so the gatekeepers to the information, the networks, the tables I wanted to sit at. It is actually, that's where I felt restricted. Thank you so much. that's the only time I felt restricted, and that's why I took it into my hands. There's only so long you'll wait to be invited to a table. I actually learned the hard way. Don't wait on the invitation. You don't even need a table. And exactly, and sometimes it's not a table, it's the floor. Maybe a carpet, a magic carpet. But I've never had that experience personally. I have experienced my parents share stories of how, you know, they were held back, and especially being surviving war and going to different countries, having to start over all the time and not having you build in one country and then you know, even coming to Canada was very difficult when we arrived. You know, my parents really thought they could come with credentials they had worked on in the Middle East, and it was worth nothing. And so as the oldest, just seeing their pain, hearing their stories, it had me thinking about myself. So personally, I've never experienced that, but I have experienced the gatekeepers of networking and communities and things like that, which really affected me in the way of, it had me down, but not for too long, because I'm the type of person that thinks, okay, solutions. Now, you know, this is what's happening. What can I do? And so from that space, from that feeling, from those emotions, I began to create opportunities for interns in my businesses. And I mentored, I, you know, inspired, I took time to do that, and didn't know that even as a photographer, that years later, my true calling in purpose would be to coach and to do it for a living. You know, to coach women and to create programs. So the curriculums I create are not just for Toronto. I create curriculums for, you know, the different spaces I'm in. And this way I get to give what I didn't get. You know, I get to not just create a space at a table, but to really lift others, you know, as in that's what it should be, to lift one another as you rise. So that community feeling is something that goes with me. But when I think of the root of why I do how I do, it reminds me that there were moments and pauses in my life, and I'm speaking not just from an individual, I'm speaking from a mother's perspective too, because if you know, you remember the age groups I was dealing with, I have these pauses in between these pregnancies where I'm either changing diapers or potty training, but also not knowing that as much as I love being with my children at home, there is more to me. There's this purpose, there's something that is inside of me that will change a generation, and how do I access that? But not having the access to mentors as well, you know, it can really make you feel stuck. So when I created these internships, these mentorship programs, it was because I couldn't find it, and once I learned and educated myself, it's useless to me to keep it all to myself. I have to share it.
I love the sentiments that we're sharing here, because, you know, we've said it already, the importance of us learning what we know and wanting to share that with the world and share that with other people is such a big passion for everyone here on the stage, and I really do admire that. Charlene, how about you? Have you experienced inaccess in any way to education through your journey?
I'm not going to say I had any, as you, I have immigrant parents, so for them, it was just lack of knowledge. Being the youngest, I was always a rebel. So I always wanted to do my own thing. I knew what I want, and I always gone after it. So for me, after high school, you know, I decided, okay, I want to be a social worker. My aunt was a social worker, and then I said, you know, for me, it was too emotional for me, and I know that I would take those things home with me. So I took a year off. I worked. I saved money. My parents were like, well, you know, aren't you gonna go to college? Aren't you gonna? I said, no, this is what I want to do. I'm gonna save my own money. You don't have to worry because, well, first of all, they didn't have the money to send me to college. They both worked, my mom worked 2 jobs. My dad worked in a factory. He was a welder, worked in a factory. So they had 3 kids. My dad ended up, my sister was born in Trinidad. My dad spent money to send for her, to bring her to Canada. So all of that money went into, you know, bringing my sister here and, you know, supporting 3 kids. So back then, it's not a lot of money. So for me, they didn't have the money to send us to college. So I decided, you know, I'm gonna take the year off, work, and I said, you know what? My dad has been such an influence in my life, my grandmother. You know what, I'm gonna go to culinary school. And that was my passion. I loved cooking. I loved creating things, you know, for my household and doing dinner parties. And then also, I'm a creative, I'm a hands-on and creative person. So that is how I learned. And I said, for me to go into social work was not really my calling. It was something that I love kids. I love the education, like teaching kids and that aspect of it. But then I said, you know, I can do that with my cooking. So for me, I didn't really have any obstacles until I got into the corporate world, where, well, what makes you think you're so good? That was the last thing I heard before I quit my job. I had a new boss, and the last thing he said was, well, the first week he met me, he said, what makes you think you're so good at your job? I was doing this job, I was the director of events, doing this job for 13 years before he came along. And he said to me, what makes you think you're so good? And that was that day I said, I'm gonna quit my job. And it took me 3 years to save up the money, because I didn't want to be poor. I didn't want to be poor, so I said, that was the day, the last day I said, I'm not working for anybody else, I'm gonna do for myself. I want to educate my community, I want to give back to my community, because that is where my heart is, and not giving to anybody else that is going to look down upon me.
I love that. And you know, the barriers to progression in the corporate space are really real, especially as women and especially as women of color. And so that really resonated a lot with me, Sandra. And the other thing for me that was, or Charlene, the other thing that really resonated with me is this fact that, you know, resources as immigrant families, thank you, who are, you know, migrated over here for, you know, quote unquote better life, the resources, the monetary funds to fund our education is actually, you know, can really impact the access we have to education. I remember when I was making decisions around which university I would go to, money was a factor. You know, I may not have, I didn't join X program because Y program was cheaper. And you know, these are the realities of the inaccess that we have because we start from a different place than somebody else who may potentially have the resources or have the knowledge or have the network to kind of support us through this process. And I remember, you know, my parents, for example, they sort of left the choice up to me in terms of where I wanted to go and what to do. And, you know, you kind of feel misguided or unguided in many ways. And so in many ways, that sort of is an access to education and a barrier that we do face sometimes as women of color, immigrant families. And I think we can all agree that education is a crucial role in how we can move gender equity and have a more gender neutral, gender equal society. And I'm wondering from each of you, how do you think we can do that? How can we allow access to education to support gender equity? And so, Cassandra, I'll start with you on this one.
Okay, you may say that again, I'm not quite sure I know what you're asking.
So what can we do around providing access to education to move the dial on gender equity?
Well, one, I don't think access to education is just, I don't think that's the biggest issue. I think it's support and guidance to get education. And so the other thing I think is trying to ensure that, as I said, build the confidence that young women want to do, what do they want to do? They don't all have to do this, but what do they want to do? So once you build a confidence, and if we do our role as community members as well as family members, that's a large part of what the young person is exposed to in the early years. There's other parts that come through the actual institution themselves, teachers and whatever else. That's a different lens that comes onto that. But if we can actually start with more community programs, more mentorship programs, more of these programs that allow the child and the young lady to see herself in that role, see herself in the opportunities that are available. As I said, I came from a working class family, so having lawyers in the family we didn't have. Having doctors in the family we didn't have. Having entrepreneurs, that was not something in my neighborhood. So all my mom and dad knew is get an education, find something that would enable you to go further. When I remember when I quit my first job, my father was like, "What are you doing? Oh my God, Cass, you need a job to be able to live." I said, "Yeah, I don't like the job. I spent too long in the job not to like the job." That was a cockiness of me as a young person, but knowing I wanted to do something different. This was as a caretaker, a father. Dear, you need to pay your bills. You need to have a roof over your head. So somehow we have to manage those two in the child, gives them the power to say, whatever you do, you can do it, but figure out how to make that happen and how we can help you make that happen. So I think like I was just at a session before this, I really do think a lot of the programs that allow children to explore avenues for whether it's junior achievement techniques, talk about what a business looks like, whether it's getting you exposed to the arts that, I mean, you don't know until you get creative and do it. Allow children to explore those programs. And then as a community, make sure we have enough funding. So if you want to do that, there's a community fund or something that will enable you to do that. Because not all individual families will have that funding that will allow Suubi to go forward, Cassandra to go forward. But if we have community funding, nothing stops you from being able to do that. We've exposed you to what's out there. You jot down that road, and there's something that maybe we can do that.
Wonderful insights on that. And when we think about it at a global level too, when we think about access to education, what are other things we can do to ensure education is accessible, not just here in Toronto or here in Canada, but more globally? Charlene, any thoughts from you?
That's a tough one. For me, I strive to inspire people. So I think for myself, it starts with me and then spreading it to my community. So when I first started Melanated Vegan, the point of creating Melanated Vegan was to educate our community on health and wellness and make them realize that, we don't have to give up our cultural foods, our cultural dishes. A lot of people don't realize there's so many Black vegans in the community. People think it is they think it's a Caucasian thing, but there's so many Black vegans in the community, all over the world. And it's so funny when you don't know what you don't know. It's like when you first find out, it's like a phenomenon. It's like this big phenomenon. You're vegan? You're what? So for me, it's starting with self and then spreading it out, to the elders and to the children and the generations that are going to come after us.
I love that. And Kamshuka, you're nodding really reassuring. Like anything to add to that? I felt like that really resonated with you there.
It really did. Everything that Cassandra said, I want to say it all over again because I love how she put it, and Charlene as well. And really, in this world, we have, for those who know how to use it, we have social media at our fingertips. And when you talk about globally, when I expanded my network from just Toronto to literally the UK, Uganda, Atlanta, LA, New York, the places I go to, and I host these workshops, workshops, it was really because I made these connections online and through social media. But again, just sharing my experiences, not just leaving it there, but giving the tools, creating curriculum, creating content that would help people understand that, oh, it's not just me that feels that way. Oh, I didn't know that's what you say. Like, that's not, I didn't know there's a word about, there's a word that makes me understand this emotion or this, what I'm going through. So really just expanding that knowledge and exposing that knowledge that we have in the use of social media, because it's there. And, my teenagers are constantly telling me something that TikTok said. And I used to think first, you're just wasting time, you're scrolling, what are you doing on it? But then they were asking for products and different things. Like, we went out and bought these skincare products because my son saw a TikTok video and so there's education, for those who know how to use it and how to utilize it. And if you don't, there's somebody that can help you with that. But that's a way to get the word out globally, because, in a strange way, we have access to the world. It's not just now, just here. Whatever we are thinking, however we're feeling, what we want to share, what we want to explore, there's access to it. So why not use that ability while we can, And the generation before my generation is just soaking it up. So I take some tips from them when I hear them speak. I listen to how they're using it. I get my daughter, I give her my phone, I'm like, figure, what I need to do with privacy and all of that, and then give it back to me. So I'm also drawing from the generation after me, because as much as I truly enjoy listening to the stories from the generation that came before me. I'm learning, but the generation that has come after us is learning in different ways, and they're expanding themselves to the world. So it's really, if you know how to use social media, it is at your fingertips. There's a way to get that information out globally.
The double-edged sword of social media and TikTok and the too much access to it, to information, false information, fake news, etc. But love that point. And Karen, how about you? Like, how can we provide access to education to young girls and ensure that it's accessible to them?
Everything that the panel has said today, I'm just going to piggyback off of it, but it really comes down to taking an interest. You must, it sounds like a hard-edged sword, but really you've got to take an interest. And it really starts with you. It's really easy to talk and talk and talk, but at the end of the day, when it comes down, and as an entrepreneur, it comes down to you taking action. And so that action cannot be anybody else but me. So I gotta look within myself and take an interest. And if I'm not going to take an interest, put up or shut up. Excuse my expression. So that's really what it comes down to. It sounds like a little bit harsh, but it's taking an interest. And it really starts with you.
Can I just add something? I was recently in Charlotte, and I did sort of a mini tour of historical Black college down there, right? And as I'm looking around, there's some are in better shape than others. There's some that have larger endowments. I think one of the biggest issues that I see when I talk about people of color, in particular, we don't do enough getting money to these institutions. I think, if we have to invest where we live, where we play, we can't then have anybody else save us. You're saving us.
Absolutely.
And I think the same thing when we talk about global. If there are countries where young women who don't have access, we've all said we don't have a problem with the access, that's not an issue. But if there's young women who don't have access, we need to start raising funds to direct it. As I'm saying, talking to Henry said, we need to find funds to bring these kids over here. Where does that come from? If we don't have that money, who's putting that money in? So I think I'm with you, we have to be intentional about what we're doing.
Absolutely.
That's not just about my family, that's about other families and how we help that.